Sarah Martinez adjusted the air conditioning unit in the supply tent for the third time that morning, wiping sweat from her forehead as she checked her watch. 6:15. James would be back from his patrol in another hour, and she wanted to have the new equipment manifest ready for his review. The desert heat was already building, even though the sun had barely crested the horizon beyond the concrete barriers that surrounded Forward Operating Base Zulu. She had been living on the base for 3 months now, one of only a handful of civilian contractors' spouses who had been granted permission to accompany their military husbands to Iraq. The arrangement was unusual, but her logistics background and James's stellar record had convinced his commanding officer to approve the request. Sarah managed supply chains for a private contractor, ensuring that everything from ammunition to medical supplies reached the right places at the right times. It was demanding work, but it meant she could be near James during his deployment. The base was a small outpost, home to about 200 personnel, positioned strategically along a supply route that connected major coalition forces. It wasn't glamorous, but it was relatively secure. The biggest excitement in recent weeks had been a brief power outage that lasted 6 hours, and Sarah had spent most of that time reorganizing her filing system by flashlight. She picked up her coffee cup and walked to the entrance of the supply tent, looking out across the compound. Soldiers were beginning their morning routines, some heading to the mess hall, others preparing for the day's patrols. The routine was comforting in its predictability. Sarah had grown accustomed to the rhythms of military life, the precise scheduling that governed everything from meals to mission briefings. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister back in Houston. "How's the adventure going? Ready to come home yet?" Sarah smiled as she typed back. "Still here, still glad I came. James is doing important work." It was true. She had never regretted her decision to follow him here, even when the other military wives back home had questioned her sanity. James had been initially resistant to the idea when she first proposed it 6 months ago. They were sitting in their kitchen in Fort Hood, Texas, going through deployment paperwork, when she mentioned the contractor position that would allow her to join him. "It's too dangerous," he had said immediately. "I can't do my job if I'm worried about you." But Sarah had persisted. She had shown him the statistics about base security, the low incident rates for civilian contractors, and, most importantly, her qualifications for the logistics position. She had a degree in supply chain management and 3 years of experience working for a defense contractor stateside. More than that, she understood military operations. She had grown up around them. Her father, Colonel retired Robert Chen, had spent 30 years in the Army before retiring to run a cattle ranch in West Texas. Sarah had learned to shoot before she learned to drive, spending weekends at the rifle range with her dad and competing in marksmanship competitions throughout high school and college. She had been good at it, really good. Good enough to earn a full scholarship to Texas A&M, where she had continued competing until her senior year. That was when she met James at a campus military appreciation event. He was a young lieutenant then, confident and passionate about his career. They talked for hours that night about everything from military history to their shared love of old Western movies. 6 months later, they were engaged. 2 years after that, they were married in a small ceremony at her father's ranch. James had known about her shooting background, of course, but it was something from her past. After college, she had put away her rifles and focused on building her career. The competitive shooting circuit required extensive travel and training time that didn't fit with her new life as a military wife. She had sold her competition rifles and bought a small pistol for home protection, but that was the extent of her involvement with firearms. Now, standing in the morning heat of an Iraqi forward operating base, those skills felt like a lifetime ago. Sarah had touched a rifle exactly twice since arriving at the base, both times during mandatory familiarization training for civilian contractors. She had performed adequately, hitting the required targets at basic distances, but nothing that would indicate her previous expertise. She had intentionally kept her scores modest, not wanting to draw attention or complicate her status as a non-combatant. The routine training had been conducted by Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a patient instructor who worked with all the civilian personnel. He had complimented her natural stance and steady hands but had not pressed for details about her background. Sarah preferred it that way. She was here to do logistics work, not to relive her competitive shooting days. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The morning supply report from the Central Distribution Center. Sarah walked back to her desk and began reviewing the incoming shipment details. 3 pallets of medical supplies, 2 of ammunition, and 1 containing replacement parts for vehicles. Standard weekly delivery, scheduled to arrive by helicopter at 10:00 hours. She cross-referenced the manifest with her current inventory levels, noting that they were running low on certain antibiotics and pain medications. The base medical officer had mentioned the shortage yesterday during the daily briefing. Sarah made a note to prioritize the medical pallet during unloading and to personally verify the controlled substances count. Outside, she could hear the morning briefing beginning in the command tent. James's voice carried faintly through the desert air as he reported on the previous day's patrol results. His unit had been conducting route security missions, escorting supply convoys through potentially dangerous areas. It was dangerous work, but James had 8 years of experience and one of the best teams on the base. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of pride and worry that accompanied thoughts of James's missions. She supported his career completely, understood the importance of what he was doing, but she never stopped being aware of the risks. Every morning when he left the wire, she said a small prayer. Every evening when he returned, she felt a wave of relief. They had been married for 4 years now, and military life had shaped their relationship in ways that civilian couples might not understand. The deployments, the uncertainty, the knowledge that his job sometimes put him in harm's way had created a bond between them that was both strong and complex. They had learned to make the most of their time together, to communicate efficiently and honestly, and to support each other through challenges that tested many military families. Coming to Iraq together had been an unexpected gift in that regard. Instead of counting down days until his return from deployment, they were sharing the experience. They ate breakfast together most mornings, debriefed each other's days in the evening, and fell asleep in the same small room every night. It wasn't exactly a normal married life, but it was theirs. A knock on the tent flap interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Martinez? Package for you." Private Jenkins, barely 19 years old and perpetually cheerful, handed her a small box from the mail delivery. Sarah thanked him and checked the return address. Her sister had sent another care package, this one filled with her favorite coffee and some paperback novels. She opened one of the books, a mystery novel set in small-town Montana, and read the first few pages while finishing her coffee. The story was engaging, full of interesting characters and unexpected plot developments. Sarah had always been an avid reader, and books had become her primary entertainment during off-duty hours on the base. The internet connection was unreliable, and television programming was limited, so she had rediscovered her love of reading. At 6:45, she heard the familiar sound of vehicles returning from patrol. James's convoy was back early, which usually meant an uneventful mission. Sarah felt the standard wave of relief wash over her as she heard his voice calling out instructions to his team. In 15 minutes, he would stop by the supply tent to check on her before heading to debrief with the commanding officer. She saved her work on the laptop and began organizing the papers on her desk. The morning routine was almost complete. In a few hours, she would oversee the helicopter resupply, update her inventory records, and prepare the afternoon report. It was satisfying work, the kind that provided clear objectives and measurable results. The sound of James's boots on the gravel outside made her smile. He appeared at the tent entrance, still wearing his full combat gear but grinning widely. "Morning, beautiful. How's the supply business?" "Thriving," she replied, standing up to give him a quick kiss. "Medical supplies coming in today, and we're finally getting those vehicle parts that have been on backorder for 2 weeks." "Outstanding. Any coffee left?" She poured him a cup from the pot she kept on the small table beside her desk. James sat down in the folding chair across from her workstation, the familiar ritual of their morning check-in. He would spend 10 minutes telling her about the patrol, she would update him on any supply issues that might affect his missions, and then he would go handle his official responsibilities. "Route was quiet," he said, pulling off his helmet and running a hand through his damp hair. "No incidents, no suspicious activity. Almost boring, which is exactly how I like my patrols." "Good," Sarah replied, meaning it completely. Boring patrols meant everyone came home safely. "Commander wants to expand our sector next week," James continued. "There's been some insurgent activity about 15 kilometers north of our usual route. Nothing major, but Command wants us to start doing presence patrols in that area." Sarah nodded, making a mental note to review the supply requirements for extended patrols. More fuel, more water, possibly overnight rations if the missions extended beyond single-day operations. They talked for a few more minutes about logistics and schedules, the comfortable conversation of a married couple who understood each other's work. At exactly 7 o'clock, James finished his coffee and stood up to leave. "See you at lunch?" he asked. "Absolutely. I'll have the afternoon supply report finished by then." He gave her another quick kiss and headed toward the command tent. Sarah watched him walk away, noting the confident way he moved even when loaded down with gear. After 4 years of marriage, she still found herself admiring his professionalism and dedication. She turned back to her work, opening the laptop to review the morning email traffic. 3 new messages from the supply depot, 2 from her contracting company's headquarters, and 1 from the base medical officer confirming the antibiotic shortage. The sun was getting higher now, and the temperature was climbing steadily. By noon, it would be over 100 degrees. Sarah adjusted the air conditioning again and settled in for what looked like a routine Tuesday morning at Forward Operating Base Zulu. At 6:28, she was typing a response to the medical officer's email when the first mortar shell screamed overhead. The sound was unmistakable and terrifying, a high-pitched whistle that seemed to split the air itself. Sarah's hands froze over the keyboard as the shell impacted somewhere behind the command tent, the explosion shaking the ground beneath her feet and rattling every piece of equipment in the supply tent. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, the base alarm began wailing, and she heard the first shouts of incoming. "Take cover." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She dropped to the floor beside her desk, away from the tent walls and any potential flying debris. Her heart was pounding, but her mind was clear. This was what she had been briefed on during her first week on base, the scenario that everyone hoped would never happen but that everyone prepared for. The second mortar shell landed closer, near the vehicle maintenance area. The third was even closer, somewhere near the living quarters. Sarah could hear voices shouting orders, boots running on gravel, and the distinctive sound of weapons being readied for combat. She reached for the radio on her desk, the one that connected her to the base command frequency. The voices coming through were urgent but controlled, professional soldiers responding to contact with the enemy. James's voice was among them, calm and clear as he reported his unit's status and requested orders. "Base is under attack," someone said over the radio. "Multiple mortars, suspected small arms fire from the northeast. All personnel to defensive positions." Sarah realized that she was still lying on the floor of a supply tent that offered virtually no protection from incoming fire. She needed to get to the bunker that had been designated for civilian personnel, a reinforced structure near the center of the base. But that meant leaving the relative safety of her position and moving across open ground while the base was under attack. Another mortar shell landed, this one close enough that she could feel the heat from the explosion. Dust and debris rained down through the tent ceiling. Sarah made her decision. She grabbed her personal protective equipment from the hook beside her desk, the helmet and body armor that all civilian contractors were required to keep readily available. As she strapped on the gear, Sarah's mind flashed back to conversations with her father about staying calm under pressure, about thinking clearly when everything around you was chaos. She had never imagined that those lessons would be relevant in a place like this, but she was grateful for them now. She took a deep breath, checked to make sure the radio was clipped to her vest, and prepared to make the run to the civilian bunker. Outside the tent, she could hear gunfire now, the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper sound of machine guns. The attack was escalating from mortars to direct fire, which meant enemy forces were close enough to target individual positions on the base. Sarah pushed aside the tent flap and looked out across the compound. Smoke was rising from several locations, and she could see soldiers moving quickly between positions, setting up defensive lines and returning fire toward the source of the attack. The civilian bunker was about 50 meters away, across the main thoroughfare of the base. She started running, keeping low and moving as fast as the heavy protective gear would allow. Halfway to the bunker, she heard a different sound cutting through the chaos of battle. It was sharp and precise, the distinctive crack of a sniper rifle. But this shot was outgoing, not incoming, and it was immediately followed by a voice on the radio reporting a confirmed enemy kill. Sarah reached the bunker and dove through the entrance, joining 3 other civilian contractors who had already taken shelter. They were huddled against the reinforced walls, listening to the battle raging outside and monitoring the radio traffic for updates on the situation. "How long do these things usually last?" asked one of the contractors, a middle-aged man who managed the base's communications equipment. "Depends," replied another, a woman who worked in the finance office. Could be minutes, could be hours. Command will let us know when it's safe to come out. Sarah listened to the radio chatter, identifying voices and trying to piece together what was happening. James's unit was engaging targets to the northeast, where the initial mortar fire had originated. Another unit was reporting movement to the east, suggesting that the attack might be coming from multiple directions. The sniper fire continued, methodical and effective. Each shot was followed by a brief pause, then another shot. Someone with a precision rifle was systematically engaging targets, and, based on the radio reports, they were having significant success. Who's doing the sniper work? Sarah asked, recognizing the sound but not immediately identifying the shooter. Probably Sergeant Williams from the reconnaissance unit, replied the communications contractor. He's the designated marksman for the base. Sarah knew Williams, a quiet professional who had been friendly during her brief interactions with him. If he was the one making those shots, he was performing exceptionally well under pressure. The battle continued for another 20 minutes, with periodic mortar shells landing on or near the base and continuous small arms fire from the perimeter. Sarah tracked the progress through radio reports and the gradually changing sound of the gunfire. The enemy seemed to be withdrawing, with longer gaps between incoming rounds and fewer reports of new targets. Finally, the base commander's voice came over the radio with the words everyone was waiting to hear: all stations, all stations. Enemy contact has ceased. Maintain defensive posture but prepare for damage assessment. Sarah and the other contractors waited another 10 minutes before receiving permission to leave the bunker. As they emerged into the daylight, the scene was sobering but not as devastating as it had sounded during the height of the battle. Several buildings had been damaged by mortar fire, and there were scorch marks and debris scattered around the compound, but the base's essential functions appeared intact. She walked quickly back toward the supply tent, eager to check on her equipment and to find James. The tent had taken some debris damage but was still standing. Her laptop was covered in dust but appeared to be functional. Most importantly, none of the supply pallets had been hit, which meant that critical medical and ammunition supplies were still available for the base's operations. James appeared at the tent entrance just as she finished her initial damage assessment. He was covered in dust and sweat, but he was smiling. "You okay?" he asked, pulling her into a quick embrace. "I'm fine. Got to the bunker as soon as it started. What about your team?" "Everyone's good. Minor injuries only, nothing serious. We had excellent sniper support during the engagement. Really made the difference." Sarah looked at him curiously. "I heard the shooting. That was Sergeant Williams?" James shook his head, his smile widening. "That's the interesting part. Williams was pinned down by suppressive fire for most of the engagement. The sniper work came from Staff Sergeant Thompson, who picked up a precision rifle when the shooting started." "Thompson from logistics?" "The same. Turns out our mild-mannered supply sergeant has some serious shooting skills that he's been keeping quiet about. Command's going to want to talk to him about additional training and responsibilities." Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions hearing this story. Relief that the base had been successfully defended, pride in the professionalism of the soldiers she worked alongside, but also something else. A recognition, perhaps, of how quickly circumstances could change and how hidden skills could suddenly become critically important. "I'm glad everyone's okay," she said, meaning it completely. "It'll probably be quiet for a while now," James replied. "Attacks like this usually come in isolation, not patterns. The insurgents probe our defenses, we respond effectively, and they move on to look for easier targets." As Sarah began cleaning up her workspace and assessing what equipment might need to be replaced, she found herself thinking about Staff Sergeant Thompson and his unexpected demonstration of marksmanship skills. She wondered if there were other people on the base carrying capabilities that their daily jobs didn't reveal. The thought was still on her mind 2 hours later when the morning helicopter resupply arrived exactly on schedule, as if nothing had happened. Sarah supervised the unloading of medical supplies and vehicle parts, completed her inventory updates, and filed her routine reports. By lunchtime, Forward Operating Base Zulu had returned to normal operations. But something had changed during those 30 minutes of combat. Sarah could feel it in the way soldiers moved around the base, the increased alertness in their posture and expressions. Everyone had been reminded that they were in a combat zone, that their security depended on their ability to respond effectively to threats, and that sometimes the most important skills were ones that stayed hidden until they were desperately needed. 3 days after the first attack, Sarah was beginning to think that James had been right about isolated incidents. The base had returned to its normal rhythm, with patrols resuming their regular schedules and supply operations proceeding without interruption. She had completed the damage assessment paperwork and arranged for replacement of the equipment that had been destroyed by debris, and life seemed to have settled back into its predictable patterns. That changed at 4:30 in the morning on Friday when the base alarm wailed again. This time, Sarah was ready. She had kept her protective gear beside the bed every night since Tuesday, and she had memorized the fastest route from her quarters to the civilian bunker. She was dressed and moving within 30 seconds of the first alarm tone, with James already gone to his combat position. The second attack was different from the first. Instead of mortars followed by small arms fire, this assault began with rocket-propelled grenades targeting specific buildings, followed immediately by coordinated small arms fire from 3 different directions. The enemy had learned from their previous attempt and had developed a more sophisticated approach. Sarah reached the bunker to find it already occupied by the other civilian contractors and several off-duty soldiers who had been caught away from their assigned defensive positions. The radio chatter was more urgent this time, with reports of enemy movement from multiple directions and requests for additional ammunition at several defensive positions. "They're better organized this time," observed the communications contractor, listening to the radio traffic with professional interest. "This isn't a probing attack. They're trying to overrun specific positions." Through the reinforced walls of the bunker, Sarah could hear the battle intensifying. Machine gun fire was continuous now, punctuated by explosions and the sharp crack of individual rifle shots. The base's defensive systems were being tested more severely than they had been during the first attack. 20 minutes into the engagement, the radio reports began to indicate a serious problem. Enemy forces had established positions that provided them with cover while allowing them to pin down 2 of the base's key defensive positions. The attackers were using effective tactics, advancing under covering fire and establishing new positions that made it difficult for the base's defenders to respond. "Bravo team is taking heavy fire and running low on ammunition," came a voice over the radio. "Request immediate resupply and additional support." "Charlie position reports multiple targets with effective cover at 400 meters, reported another voice. "Unable to engage effectively with current weapons." Sarah recognized the tactical situation that was developing. The enemy had learned to stay beyond the effective range of most of the base's defensive weapons while maintaining accurate fire on key positions. They needed precision shots at longer distances to neutralize the threat, but the base's designated marksmen were apparently unable to get clear shots. "Where's Thompson?" asked someone over the radio. "We need that precision rifle work again." "Thompson's pinned down with Alpha Team," came the reply. No clear field of fire from his position. Sarah listened to this exchange with growing concern. The battle was not going as well as the first attack had gone. The enemy had adapted their tactics, and the base's defenders were struggling to respond effectively to the new challenge. "Williams is down," reported another voice. "Took shrapnel from an RPG. Need medical at checkpoint 3. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Sergeant Williams was the base's other skilled marksman, and if he was injured, the defenders were losing critical capability at exactly the moment when they needed it most. The radio traffic continued, painting a picture of a base under serious pressure. Enemy forces were maintaining their attacks from covered positions while the defenders struggled to bring effective fire to bear on them. Several soldiers had been injured, ammunition was running low at key positions, and the tactical situation was becoming increasingly difficult. "Sir, we need to consider calling for air support," suggested one of the unit commanders. "Negative," replied the base commander. "Air assets are committed elsewhere. We need to resolve this with organic capabilities." Sarah found herself thinking about the conversation she'd had with James after the first attack, about hidden skills becoming important when circumstances changed. She thought about Staff Sergeant Thompson's unexpected marksmanship abilities and how they had made the difference in repelling the previous assault. Without making a conscious decision, Sarah stood up from her position against the bunker wall. "Where are you going?" asked one of the other contractors. "I need to check on something," Sarah replied, moving toward the bunker entrance. "You can't go out there," protested the communications contractor. "It's not safe." Sarah paused at the entrance, listening to the gunfire outside and the increasingly urgent radio reports. She thought about James and his team, pinned down somewhere on the perimeter. She thought about the injured soldiers who were depending on the base's defenders to repel this attack. She thought about her father and the shooting lessons that had seemed like ancient history just 4 days ago. "I'll be careful," she said, and stepped out into the battle. The scene outside the bunker was dramatically different from what she had experienced during the first attack. Smoke was thick in the air, reducing visibility and creating an eerie atmosphere as gunfire echoed from multiple directions. Sarah could see soldiers moving between positions, carrying ammunition and medical supplies to the defensive perimeters. She moved quickly toward the armory, staying low and using buildings for cover. The armory was a reinforced structure near the center of the base where weapons and ammunition were stored. If she was going to be useful in this situation, she would need access to a precision rifle and appropriate ammunition. The armory was staffed by Corporal Davis, a young soldier who was responsible for weapons maintenance and distribution. Sarah found him preparing additional magazines for delivery to the fighting positions. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be out here," he said immediately upon seeing her. "Corporal, I need to borrow a sniper rifle," Sarah said directly. Davis looked at her with confusion. "Ma'am, I can't issue weapons to civilian contractors. It's against regulations." "The regulations don't account for the current situation," Sarah replied calmly. "Your designated marksmen are either pinned down or injured, and your defensive positions are being overrun. I have the skills to help, but I need the equipment." "I don't understand, ma'am." Sarah looked at the young soldier, recognizing the conflict between his training and the extraordinary circumstances they faced. "Corporal Davis, are you familiar with my background?" "No, ma'am." "Just that you're married to Captain Martinez and you work in supply. Before I came here, I was a competitive marksman for 6 years. I won 3 state championships and placed second in nationals twice. I can make shots that will help break up those enemy positions, but I need a precision rifle to do it." Davis stared at her for a moment, processing this information while gunfire continued outside. "Ma'am, even if that's true, I still can't issue weapons without proper authorization." "Then, get me someone who can authorize it," Sarah said firmly. Davis reached for his radio, then hesitated. "The base commander is kind of busy right now, ma'am." Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice, the recognition that normal procedures didn't quite fit the current emergency. She decided to take a different approach. "Corporal, what's your assessment of how the battle is going?" Davis considered the question seriously. "Honestly, ma'am, not great. The enemy has better positions this time, and we're having trouble engaging them effectively." "And what happens if we can't break up their attack?" "They could potentially overrun our defensive positions," Davis admitted reluctantly. Sarah nodded. "So the choice is between following peacetime regulations and potentially losing the base, or making an exception that might save lives." Davis was quiet for a long moment, listening to the radio reports of wounded soldiers and dwindling ammunition. Finally, he made his decision. "Ma'am, if you're really qualified to use a precision rifle, there's an M24 sniper system that's been zeroed and ready. But I need you to understand that I'm taking a huge risk by doing this." "I understand completely, and I take full responsibility for requesting it." Davis led her to the weapons rack and retrieved the M24 system, a bolt-action rifle specifically designed for precision shooting at extended ranges. He also provided a spotting scope and appropriate ammunition, talking her through the weapon's specific characteristics and the environmental conditions that might affect her shots. "The rifle is zeroed for 500 meters, he explained. "Wind is currently light and variable from the northeast. Temperature is about 95 degrees. Sarah examined the weapon, checking the scope settings and testing the bolt action. It was a high-quality system, well-maintained and properly configured. She felt the familiar comfort of a precision rifle in her hands, the balance and weight distribution that brought back memories of countless hours at the range with her father. "I need to get to an elevated position with clear fields of fire toward the enemy positions," she said. Davis considered this. "The command bunker has a good observation post on the roof. It's got sandbag protection and clear sight lines in multiple directions. Can you get me there?" "Yes, ma'am." "Follow me." They moved quickly across the compound, using buildings and defensive positions for cover while making their way toward the command bunker. The journey took 5 minutes and required them to wait twice for enemy fire to shift to other targets before moving. The command bunker was a reinforced concrete structure that served as the base's tactical operations center during combat. The observation post on its roof was accessed by an internal ladder and, protected by sandbags arranged to provide cover while allowing observation in all directions. Sarah climbed to the position and immediately began assessing the tactical situation. Through the spotting scope, she could see enemy positions that had been established in ruins and natural cover about 400 to 600 meters from the base perimeter. The attackers had chosen their positions well, using terrain features that provided protection while allowing them to maintain effective fire on the base's defensive positions. She could also see why the base's defenders were having difficulty. The enemy positions were at ranges that challenged most of the standard infantry weapons, and the available cover made it difficult to achieve precision shots. What was needed was accurate fire that could penetrate the enemy's cover or force them to abandon their advantageous positions. Sarah set up the rifle on the sandbag rest and began the process of range estimation and environmental assessment that preceded any precision shot. The skills came back naturally, muscle memory and mental processes that had been developed through years of training and competition. Her first target was an enemy machine gun position that had been maintaining suppressive fire on one of the base's key defensive positions. The machine gunner was partially concealed behind a concrete wall, but Sarah could see enough of his position to make an accurate shot. She adjusted the scope for range and windage, controlled her breathing, and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, consistent pressure that her father had taught her years ago. The shot was perfect, striking the machine gunner's center mass and immediately silencing his weapon. The effect on the battle was immediate and dramatic. The base's defenders, no longer pinned down by the machine gun fire, were able to advance their positions and bring more effective fire to bear on other enemy positions. Sarah quickly identified her next target, an enemy rifleman who had been engaging one of the base's observation posts. The range was longer, about 550 meters, but the target was clearly visible through the scope. She made the necessary adjustments and fired again, another precise shot that neutralized the threat. Over the next 15 minutes, Sarah systematically engaged enemy positions that were providing the most effective fire against the base's defenders. Each shot was carefully planned and precisely executed, targeting enemies who were in positions that made them difficult to engage with standard infantry weapons. The radio traffic began to change as the tactical situation shifted in favor of the defenders. Reports of effective sniper fire came from multiple positions, and commanders began reporting that enemy fire was decreasing in intensity and accuracy. "Unknown sniper, this is base commander," came a voice over the radio. "Outstanding work. Continue engaging targets of opportunity." Sarah continued her methodical engagement of enemy positions, working through her ammunition supply while maintaining the precise, disciplined approach that had made her successful in competition. Each shot was an individual problem to be solved, requiring assessment of range, wind, and target characteristics. By the time she fired her 20th round, the enemy attack was collapsing. The precision fire had disrupted their coordinated assault, forcing them to abandon their prepared positions and retreat to locations that offered concealment but eliminated their ability to maintain effective fire on the base. All stations, came the base commander's voice. "Enemy forces are withdrawing. Maintain defensive posture but prepare for casualty evacuation and damage assessment." Sarah set down the rifle and took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline that had sustained her through the engagement begin to subside. She had fired 23 rounds and achieved what she estimated to be 18 effective hits on enemy positions. Most importantly, the base's defenders had successfully repelled a serious attack with minimal casualties. Corporal Davis appeared at the top of the ladder, his face showing a mixture of relief and amazement. "Ma'am, that was incredible shooting. Command wants to know who was providing the sniper support." Sarah began disassembling the rifle system, preparing to return it to the armory. "Tell them it was a civilian contractor who happened to have the appropriate skills." "Ma'am, I think they're going to want more details than that." Sarah looked out across the compound, where soldiers were beginning to move more freely as the immediate threat diminished. She could see medical personnel treating the wounded and damage assessment teams beginning their work. "I'm sure they will," she said. "But, for now, let's focus on taking care of the people who got hurt and making sure this equipment gets properly cleaned and returned to service." As they climbed down from the observation post, Sarah realized that her life at Forward Operating Base Zulu was about to change significantly. The skills that she had kept hidden for the sake of maintaining her status as a non-combatant had just been revealed in the most dramatic way possible. James was waiting for her at the bottom of the ladder, still wearing his combat gear but with an expression of amazement and pride that she had never seen before. "Sarah, what the hell did you just do?" he asked. "I helped," she replied simply. "You helped? You single-handedly broke up their attack. Where did that come from?" Sarah looked at her husband, the man who knew almost everything about her but who had never seen her in a combat situation. "It came from my father's ranch in Texas and 6 years of competitive shooting." "Same place it always came from." James stared at her for a moment, then pulled her into an embrace. "You saved a lot of lives today. We all saved lives today. I just happened to be in a position to contribute in a way that I hadn't expected." As they walked back toward the supply tent, Sarah was already thinking about the conversations that would follow. The base commander would want a detailed briefing. Her contracting company would need to be notified about her change in duties. Most importantly, she and James would need to discuss how this development would affect their relationship and their future plans. But, for now, she was content to walk beside her husband across the compound of Forward Operating Base Zulu, knowing that when her skills had been needed, she had been ready to use them. The briefing with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the base commander, took place 6 hours after the attack ended. Sarah sat in the command bunker conference room, still wearing the dusty civilian clothes she had put on that morning, facing a table of senior military officers who were trying to understand exactly what had happened during the engagement. "Mrs. Martinez," began the colonel, "I need to be clear about something from the start. What you did today was extraordinary, and it probably saved lives. But it also created a significant administrative and legal situation that we need to address." Sarah nodded, having expected this conversation. "I understand, sir. Can you walk us through your decision-making process when you left the civilian bunker?" Sarah had spent the previous hours thinking about how to explain her actions, how to articulate the thought process that had led her to pick up a rifle during a combat engagement. "Sir, I was listening to the radio traffic and realized that the base was in serious tactical difficulty. The designated marksmen were either injured or unable to engage effectively, and enemy positions were causing significant problems for our defensive positions." "And you felt qualified to address that situation?" "Sir, I felt that I had skills that could potentially help, and that the circumstances were serious enough to warrant the risk of using those skills." Major Stevens, the base operations officer, consulted a folder in front of him. "Mrs. Martinez, we've reviewed your personnel file, and there's no indication of military training or combat experience. Can you explain where you acquired the marksmanship skills you demonstrated today?" Sarah spent the next 20 minutes detailing her shooting background, from her childhood training with her father through her collegiate competition career. She described the level of training she had maintained and the specific skills that had enabled her to engage effectively at the ranges and under the conditions present during the attack. "You mentioned that you intentionally kept your scores modest during the contractor familiarization training," observed Captain Richardson, the base intelligence officer. "Why did you choose to conceal your abilities?" "Sir, I came here as a logistics contractor to support my husband's deployment. I didn't want to complicate that role by introducing questions about combat capabilities or potential conflicts with my non-combatant status." Lieutenant Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, considering her response. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. Based on today's performance and your described background, you have skills that could be extremely valuable to this base's defensive capabilities. The question is whether there's a legal and practical way to utilize those skills while maintaining your civilian contractor status." Sarah had been thinking about this same question throughout the afternoon. "Sir, what would be required to make that possible?" "That's what we're trying to determine. Your contracting company would need to approve an expanded role, the legal office would need to review the implications for your non-combatant status, and we would need to establish protocols for integrating civilian marksmen into combat operations." Major Stevens spoke up. "There's also the question of liability and insurance coverage. If something happened to you during a combat engagement, there could be significant legal complications." The discussion continued for another hour, covering various aspects of the administrative and legal challenges involved in formally recognizing Sarah's combat skills. The officers were clearly interested in finding a way to make use of her abilities, but they were also aware of the regulatory complications that would be involved. "For now," concluded Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, "I'm going to recommend that you continue in your current logistics role while we research the possibilities for expanding your duties. In the meantime, I want you to work with our training staff to document your skills and develop protocols for potential future engagements. Sarah agreed to this approach, recognizing that it represented the best possible outcome given the unusual circumstances. As she left the briefing, she was accompanied by Master Sergeant Phillips, the base's senior non-commissioned officer, who would be responsible for coordinating her training activities. "Ma'am," said Phillips as they walked across the compound, "I've been in the Army for 22 years, and I've never seen shooting like what you did today. Where exactly did you learn to do that?" Sarah smiled at the question, which she had been asked multiple times since the engagement ended. "Sergeant, it started with my father teaching me to hunt rabbits when I was 8 years old. Everything that happened today came from that foundation." "Well, ma'am, I hope we can figure out a way to make use of those skills, because they're exactly what this base needs." The next morning, Sarah reported to the base range facility for what was officially described as a skills assessment session. In practice, it was an opportunity for the military training staff to observe her shooting capabilities under controlled conditions and to begin developing the documentation that would be required for any formal recognition of her combat role. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, who had conducted her original contractor familiarization training, was present for the session along with 2 other instructors. Also present was Staff Sergeant Thompson, the supply sergeant whose own marksmanship skills had been revealed during the first attack. "Mrs. Martinez," began Rodriguez, "we're going to run you through a series of exercises designed to evaluate precision shooting skills at various ranges and under different conditions. The goal is to establish a baseline assessment of your capabilities." The assessment began with standard marksmanship exercises at known distances, progressing from 200 meters to 800 meters. Sarah performed consistently, placing her shots within the scoring rings that would be expected of a trained military marksman. The instructors made notes on her technique, her consistency, and her ability to adjust for changing conditions. "Outstanding work," commented Rodriguez after the first series of exercises. "Let's move on to unknown distance targets." The unknown distance exercises required Sarah to estimate ranges and make appropriate scope adjustments without prior knowledge of the actual distances to the targets. This skill was critical for combat situations where precise range information might not be available. Sarah performed well on these exercises also, demonstrating the range estimation skills that had been developed through years of competitive shooting. Her estimates were consistently within acceptable margins of error, and her resulting shots were accurate enough to neutralize simulated enemy positions. "Ma'am," said Staff Sergeant Thompson, "I'm curious about your competition background. What disciplines did you compete in?" Sarah described her experience in various precision shooting competitions, explaining the different skills required for each discipline and how they had contributed to her overall marksmanship development. Thompson, who had also competed in civilian shooting sports before joining the Army, was able to ask detailed questions about her training methods and competitive experiences. The assessment continued with exercises designed to evaluate her performance under stress and time pressure. These exercises simulated some of the conditions that might be present during combat engagements, requiring quick target acquisition and accurate shooting while under artificial time constraints. "This is where we separate the recreational shooters from the people who can actually perform in combat," Rodriguez explained. Accuracy under pressure is a completely different skill from accuracy at a leisurely pace. Sarah performed well on the stress exercises, maintaining her accuracy even when required to engage multiple targets quickly or when subjected to artificial distractions designed to simulate combat stress. Her competitive experience had included similar exercises, and she was able to apply the mental techniques she had learned for maintaining focus under pressure. After 4 hours of assessment, the instructors had gathered comprehensive data on her shooting capabilities. The results confirmed what had been demonstrated during the previous day's engagement. Sarah possessed marksmanship skills that were equivalent to or superior to those of trained military marksmen. "Ma'am," concluded Rodriguez, "based on today's assessment, I would rate your precision shooting skills as expert level. You demonstrated consistent accuracy at all ranges, effective performance under pressure, and excellent technique throughout all exercises." The formal assessment documentation would be forwarded to the base commander and to Sarah's contracting company as part of the review process for potentially expanding her duties. In the meantime, Rodriguez recommended that she be provided with regular access to the range facilities to maintain her skills. That afternoon, Sarah returned to her normal logistics duties, processing supply requests and coordinating shipments as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and she could feel it in the way soldiers interacted with her throughout the day. "Mrs. Martinez," said Private Jenkins when he delivered the afternoon mail, I heard you were the one doing that incredible sniper work yesterday. I helped out when I could, Sarah replied, maintaining the modest tone she had adopted when discussing the engagement. Ma'am, my dad's a hunter back in Wyoming, and he always said that good shooting was about more than just equipment. He said it was about staying calm and thinking clearly when everything else was going crazy. Sarah looked at the young soldier, recognizing the genuine respect in his voice. Your dad was right. The technical skills are important, but the mental side is what makes the difference when it really matters. Similar conversations occurred throughout the week as word of her performance spread through the base. Soldiers who had previously known her only as Captain Martinez's wife and the supply logistics coordinator began approaching her with questions about shooting techniques and stories about their own experiences with firearms. Sarah found herself becoming an informal mentor to several of the younger soldiers, sharing knowledge about marksmanship fundamentals and mental preparation techniques. It was a role she had not anticipated, but one that felt natural and rewarding. The administrative review process continued in the background, with lawyers and contracting officers working to determine whether there was a legal framework for formally recognizing her combat capabilities. The discussions involved multiple agencies and required consideration of regulations that had not been designed for situations like hers. James was supportive throughout this process, though Sarah could tell that he was still adjusting to the revelation of her combat skills. They had been married for 4 years, and he had known about her competitive shooting background, but seeing her perform in actual combat had been a different experience entirely. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been here, he said one evening as they sat in their small quarters. If the attack had come 6 months ago, before you arrived, or if you had decided to stay in Texas during this deployment. Sarah considered the question seriously. Someone else would have found a way to deal with it. That's what soldiers do. They adapt and overcome. Maybe, but it might have cost lives. Your skills made a real difference. They talked about the possibility that her role on the base might change if the administrative review resulted in an expanded job description. James was concerned about the increased risk that combat duties would involve, but he also recognized the value of her capabilities to the base's defensive posture. I want to support whatever decision you make, he said. But I also want to make sure you understand what you might be getting into. I understand that it's dangerous, Sarah replied. But so is being on a forward operating base in a combat zone. At least if I'm formally recognized for these skills, I'll have appropriate training and support. The following week brought news that the legal review had identified a potential solution. Sarah's contracting company had agreed to modify her job description to include specialized security support duties, which would allow her to participate in defensive operations while maintaining her civilian contractor status. The arrangement would require additional training in military procedures and communication protocols, as well as regular assessments to ensure that her skills remained at acceptable levels. But it would formally recognize her combat capabilities and provide the legal framework for her participation in future defensive engagements. Mrs. Martinez, said Lieutenant Colonel Morrison when he called her in to discuss the results of the review, this is an unusual situation, and we're essentially creating a new model for civilian contractor involvement in combat operations. Are you comfortable with taking on this expanded role? Sarah had spent considerable time thinking about this decision, weighing the risks against the potential benefits to the base's defensive capabilities. Sir, I'm comfortable with it. I think I can make a valuable contribution, and I want to help protect the people I work with. Outstanding. We'll begin the additional training next week, and we'll develop protocols for integrating you into our defensive planning. As Sarah left the command bunker, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She had come to Iraq as a logistics contractor looking forward to a quiet deployment supporting her husband's military career. Now she was about to become something that had never existed before, a civilian contractor with formal combat responsibilities. The change felt both natural and surprising. Natural because it represented a recognition of skills she had always possessed, but surprising because she had never imagined using those skills in a place like Forward Operating Base Zulu. That evening, she called her father in Texas to tell him about the developments. Colonel Chen listened to her description of the engagement and the subsequent administrative changes with the professional interest of a career soldier and the pride of a parent. Sarah, I'm proud of what you did, but I'm also concerned about what you're getting into, he said. Combat is different from competition, and the stakes are a lot higher when people are shooting back. I know, Dad. But I also know that I have skills that can help protect people, and I think I have a responsibility to use them when they're needed. That's the right attitude. Just remember that your first priority is to come home safely to your husband and to your family. Sarah promised to be careful and to maintain the focus on safety that he had taught her from the beginning of her shooting education. As she ended the call, she realized that she was looking forward to the additional training and the opportunity to contribute more directly to the base's security. The following Monday morning, she reported to the command bunker for the first of her expanded training sessions, ready to begin learning the military procedures that would allow her to integrate her civilian marksmanship skills into the base's defensive operations. 6 weeks after her first combat engagement, Sarah had settled into a routine that balanced her original logistics responsibilities with her new role as the base's civilian marksman specialist. Her mornings typically began with a weapons inspection and radio check, followed by coordination with the base intelligence officer to review potential threats and target areas. Afternoons were spent on supply management and administrative duties, but she was always prepared to respond immediately if the tactical situation required her specialized skills. The additional training had gone well. Sarah had learned military communication protocols, studied the base's defensive plans, and practiced coordination with the various units responsible for perimeter security. She had also spent considerable time working with the intelligence staff to understand how to identify and prioritize targets during combat engagements. The key difference between competition shooting and combat shooting, Sergeant First Class Rodriguez had explained during one of her training sessions, is that in competition, you're trying to hit the center of a known target at a known distance. In combat, you're trying to neutralize threats that may be moving, partially concealed, and shooting back at you. Sarah had adapted well to these different requirements. Her competitive background had provided an excellent foundation in marksmanship fundamentals, but the military training had taught her how to apply those skills in tactical situations. She had learned to quickly assess priorities when multiple targets were present, to coordinate her fire with other defensive positions, and to maintain situational awareness while focused on precision shooting. The base had experienced 2 minor probing attacks during the 6 weeks since her formal integration into the defensive plan, but neither had escalated to the level requiring her intervention. Sarah had monitored both engagements from her designated position in the command bunker observation post, ready to engage if the tactical situation developed beyond what the standard defensive positions could handle. On Thursday morning, October 12, that situation finally developed. The attack began at 0545 hours with a coordinated barrage of mortars and rocket-propelled grenades that targeted key defensive positions around the base perimeter. Unlike the previous attacks, which had been relatively limited in scope and duration, this assault was clearly designed as a major offensive operation intended to overrun the base's defenses. Sarah was awakened, moving within seconds of the first explosion, following the procedures that had been drilled during her training. She grabbed her protective equipment and the specialized radio that connected her to the Tactical Operations Center, then moved quickly to her designated position. The command bunker observation post had been modified since her integration into the defensive plan. Additional communication equipment had been installed, and the position had been stocked with ammunition and backup weapons systems. Sarah had also worked with the base engineers to improve the field of fire from the position, ensuring clear sightlines to critical areas around the perimeter. As she climbed to the observation post, Sarah could already hear the radio traffic that indicated this was a more serious engagement than the base had faced previously. Multiple units were reporting heavy contact, enemy forces were approaching from several directions simultaneously, and early reports suggested that the attackers were using more sophisticated tactics and equipment than had been seen in earlier engagements. "Overwatch, this is Base Command," came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Morrison over her tactical radio. "Sit-rep on visual contact with enemy positions." Sarah set up her rifle system and began scanning the approaches to the base through her spotting scope. "Base Command, Overwatch has visual on multiple enemy positions. Estimate 40 to 60 personnel in 3 main groups, ranges from 300 to 700 meters. Copy, Overwatch. Cleared to engage targets of opportunity. Priority is positions threatening Alpha and Bravo defensive positions." Sarah began her systematic assessment of the target environment, identifying enemy positions that were providing the most effective fire against the base's defenders. The tactical situation was more complex than the previous engagements, with enemy forces using covered approaches and coordinated movement to establish multiple firing positions. Her first target was a machine gun team that had established position behind a ruined building about 450 meters from the Alpha defensive position. The machine gun was providing suppressive fire that was preventing the Alpha team from effectively engaging other enemy positions. Sarah adjusted her scope for the range and environmental conditions, then carefully aimed at the machine gunner. The shot was complicated by the partial cover provided by the ruined wall, but she could see enough of the target to make an effective shot. The rifle recoiled smoothly against her shoulder, and, through the scope, she saw the machine gunner fall backward from his position. The machine gun fire ceased immediately, allowing the Alpha team to advance their position and engage other threats. "Good shot, Overwatch," came the report from Alpha team. Machine gun position neutralized. Sarah was already identifying her next target, an enemy rifleman who was engaging the Bravo position from a covered position near a water tower. The range was longer, about 600 meters, but the target was clearly visible and presented a good shot opportunity. She made the necessary scope adjustments and fired again, another precise shot that neutralized the threat and allowed the Bravo team to improve their tactical position. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah systematically engaged enemy positions that were providing effective fire against the base's defensive positions. Each shot was carefully planned and precisely executed, targeting enemies who were in positions that made them difficult to engage with standard infantry weapons. But this attack was different from the previous engagements. The enemy forces were more numerous, better equipped, and using more sophisticated tactics. As Sarah neutralized positions in one area, new threats appeared in other areas, requiring her to constantly reassess priorities and shift her focus to the most critical targets. "Overwatch, this is Base Command," came Morrison's voice over the radio. "Enemy forces are attempting to establish position on Hill 247 to the northeast. That position would give them observation and fire control over our entire compound." Sarah shifted her scope to the northeast, where she could see enemy forces moving up the slopes of a small hill that overlooked the base. If they succeeded in establishing position there, they would indeed have a commanding view of the entire compound and would be able to direct accurate fire at any target within the base. The range to Hill 247 was approximately 800 meters, at the extreme end of effective range for her weapon system. More challenging, the enemy forces were moving and using the terrain for cover, making them difficult targets even under ideal conditions. Sarah studied the approach routes to the hilltop, identifying likely positions where the enemy forces would have to expose themselves during their advance. She selected a position about halfway up the slope where the terrain would force them to cross an open area with minimal cover. She adjusted her scope for the extended range and began tracking the movement of the enemy forces as they advanced up the hill. When the first group reached the open area she had identified, she fired carefully aimed shots at the lead elements, forcing them to seek cover and disrupting their advance. "Excellent work, Overwatch," reported the intelligence officer. "Enemy advance on Hill 247 has been halted." But Sarah could see that the enemy forces were regrouping and attempting to find alternative routes to the hilltop. She continued to engage targets of opportunity as they appeared, but the extended range and challenging terrain made it difficult to completely stop their advance. "Base Command, Overwatch," she reported over the radio. "Enemy forces are continuing to advance on Hill 247 using multiple routes. I can slow their advance, but I cannot completely stop it from this position." "Copy, Overwatch. Charlie team is moving to establish blocking position on the eastern slope of Hill 247. Continue to provide support as able." Sarah could see Charlie team beginning their movement toward the hill, but she also realized that they would be exposed to enemy fire during their advance. She shifted her focus to providing overwatch for the friendly forces, engaging enemy positions that threatened Charlie team's movement. The next 30 minutes required the most demanding shooting Sarah had ever attempted. She was engaging targets at extended ranges, often while they were moving or partially concealed, while coordinating her fire with the movements of friendly forces who were maneuvering under enemy fire. The mental demands were intense, requiring her to track multiple moving targets, assess constantly changing priorities, and maintain the precision necessary for effective long-range shooting. She drew on every aspect of her training, from the fundamentals her father had taught her to the advanced techniques she had learned during her competitive career. "Overwatch, this is Charlie team," came a voice over the radio. "We're taking effective fire from position approximately 700 meters northeast of our location. Can you provide support?" Sarah located the enemy position that was engaging Charlie team and realized it was one of the most challenging shots she had attempted. The target was partially concealed, at extreme range, and located on terrain that required her to compensate for both elevation and wind effects. She made careful adjustments to her scope and spent several moments studying the wind conditions and environmental factors that would affect the shot. When she was satisfied with her calculations, she controlled her breathing and fired with the smooth trigger control that had been drilled into her through thousands of practice rounds. The shot was perfect, striking the enemy rifleman and immediately stopping the fire that had been threatening Charlie Team's advance. Outstanding shot, Overwatch, reported Charlie Team. Threat neutralized. Continuing advance to blocking position. The battle continued for another hour, with Sarah providing continuous precision fire support for the base's defensive operations. She engaged 47 individual targets during the engagement, achieving what intelligence estimates later confirmed were 39 effective hits against enemy positions. Most importantly, her fire had been instrumental in preventing enemy forces from establishing the observation position on Hill 247 that would have given them a decisive tactical advantage over the base's defenses. All stations, finally, came Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's voice over the radio. Enemy forces are withdrawing from contact. Maintain defensive posture but prepare for casualty evacuation and damage assessment. Sarah set down her rifle and took the first relaxed breath she had drawn in over 2 hours. Her hands were steady, but she could feel the accumulated stress of the engagement in the tension in her shoulders and the slight tremor in her legs. The observation post was littered with empty brass casings, evidence of the sustained fire she had maintained throughout the engagement. She had fired 93 rounds during the battle, more than in any single engagement during her competitive career. Master Sergeant Phillips appeared at the top of the ladder, carrying a bottle of water and wearing an expression of amazement and respect. "Ma'am, that was the most impressive display of marksmanship I've ever witnessed. Command estimates that your fire was directly responsible for repelling the enemy advance and preventing them from achieving their tactical objectives." Sarah accepted the water gratefully, realizing that she was dehydrated from the stress and heat of the prolonged engagement. "How are our casualties, Sergeant?" "Light, ma'am. 3 wounded, none seriously. Without your support, intelligence estimates suggest we could have lost the base." Sarah looked out across the compound, where soldiers were beginning to move more freely as the immediate threat diminished. Smoke was rising from several impact points where enemy mortars had struck, but the base's essential functions appeared intact. James appeared at the observation post 20 minutes later, still wearing his combat gear but with an expression of pride and relief that Sarah recognized from their previous engagements. "Sarah, what you did today was extraordinary," he said, embracing her carefully around her protective equipment. "We all did what we had to do," she replied. "I just happened to be in a position where I could contribute effectively." "The base commander wants to see you for a debrief in 1 hour," James continued. "But first, you need to eat something and get some rest." As they climbed down from the observation post, Sarah was already thinking about the after-action review that would follow. The engagement had tested every aspect of her training and had required her to perform at the absolute limits of her capabilities. But, more than that, it had confirmed that her decision to integrate her civilian marksmanship skills into the base's defensive operations had been the right choice. Her skills had made a measurable difference in the outcome of a serious combat engagement, and she had proven that civilian contractors could contribute meaningfully to military operations when they possessed relevant expertise. The debrief with Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and his staff lasted for 3 hours and covered every aspect of her performance during the engagement. The officers were particularly interested in her decision-making process when engaging targets at extended ranges and her coordination with the maneuvering friendly forces. "Mrs. Martinez," concluded the colonel, "today's engagement demonstrates that the integration of civilian specialist skills into military operations can be highly effective when properly implemented. Your performance exceeded all expectations and contributed significantly to our successful defense of this base." As Sarah left the command bunker, she realized that the test she had just passed was not only of her marksmanship skills but of her ability to function effectively as part of a military team under the most demanding circumstances possible. She had met that test successfully, and she knew that her role at Forward Operating Base Zulu would never be quite the same again. 3 months after the major engagement on Hill 247, Sarah Martinez stood in a different kind of briefing room, this one located in the Pentagon, addressing a panel of senior military officers and civilian defense officials. The setting was far removed from the dust and heat of Forward Operating Base Zulu, but the questions being asked were directly related to her experiences during those intense months in Iraq. Mrs. Martinez, said General Patricia Hawkins, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower and Reserve Affairs, your case has generated considerable interest at the highest levels of military leadership. We're trying to understand whether your experience represents an isolated incident or a model that could be applied more broadly. Sarah had returned from Iraq 6 weeks earlier, accompanying James as his unit completed their deployment rotation. The transition back to stateside life had been complicated by the fact that her experiences in Iraq had attracted attention from military researchers studying innovative approaches to force multipliers and civilian contractor integration. Ma'am, I think my experience demonstrates that there are civilian skill sets that can be valuable in combat situations, but only when properly integrated into military command structures and training programs. The briefing room contained representatives from multiple military services, defense contractors, and academic institutions studying military innovation. Sarah's case had become a subject of professional interest because it represented something that had never been formally documented before: a civilian contractor who had successfully transitioned into a combat role while maintaining non-combatant status. Colonel James Peterson, representing the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, leaned forward in his chair. Mrs. Martinez, can you describe the specific training and integration processes that made your transition successful? Sarah spent the next 30 minutes detailing the procedures that had been developed at Forward Operating Base Zulu, from the initial skills assessment through the coordination protocols that had enabled her to function effectively as part of the base's defensive operations. She emphasized the importance of proper legal framework, comprehensive training, and clear command relationships. The key factor, she explained, was that everyone understood exactly what my role was and what authorities I had. There was never any confusion about command relationships or responsibilities. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a defense analyst from RAND Corporation who was studying civilian contractor roles in military operations, asked detailed questions about the decision-making processes during combat engagements. How did you balance your civilian contractor status with the immediate tactical requirements of combat situations? Dr. Chen, once the legal framework was established and the training was completed, the tactical requirements became the primary consideration. In combat, everyone has to function as part of the team, regardless of their administrative status. The questions continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Sarah's experience from her initial decision to reveal her shooting skills through the complex administrative process that had enabled her formal integration into combat operations. The panel was particularly interested in understanding which elements of her experience could be replicated and which were unique to her specific circumstances. Lieutenant General Robert Anderson, representing the Joint Chiefs of Staff, summarized the panel's interest. Mrs. Martinez, we're examining ways to better utilize civilian expertise in military operations while maintaining appropriate legal and administrative safeguards. Your experience provides a valuable case study for that examination. Sarah understood the broader implications of her story. Military forces were increasingly relying on civilian contractors for specialized functions, and her experience suggested that some civilians might possess skills that could contribute directly to combat operations if properly integrated. Sir, I think the most important lesson is that you can't just assume that someone's job title accurately reflects all of their capabilities. There are probably people throughout the military system who have skills that aren't being utilized because those skills aren't part of their formal job descriptions. After the Pentagon briefing, Sarah and James drove to their new assignment at Fort Carson, Colorado, where James would be serving as a company commander and Sarah would be returning to civilian defense contracting work. The change of scenery from the Iraqi desert to the Colorado mountains was dramatic, but Sarah found herself missing some aspects of the intense focus and clear mission that had characterized her months at Forward Operating Base Zulu. Do you think you'll miss it? James asked as they unpacked boxes in their new quarters. The combat role, I mean. Sarah considered the question carefully. I'll miss the sense of purpose and the knowledge that I was making a direct contribution to mission success. But I won't miss the stress or the constant awareness that people were trying to kill us. They had talked extensively about her experiences during the weeks since returning from Iraq, working through the psychological and emotional aspects of her transition from civilian contractor to combat participant and back to civilian life. The experiences had changed both of them, and their relationship had evolved to incorporate the shared understanding of what they had accomplished together. I'm proud of what you did over there, James said, looking up from a box of books. Not just the shooting, but the way you adapted to a completely new role and performed under pressure. We both adapted, Sarah replied. And we both learned things about ourselves that we didn't know before. The official after-action reports from Forward Operating Base Zulu had documented the measurable impact of Sarah's contributions to the base's defensive operations. Over the course of her 4-month integration into combat operations, she had engaged 137 enemy targets with an assessed effectiveness rate of 86%. More significantly, intelligence analysis suggested that her precision fire had been decisive in repelling 3 major attacks that could have resulted in the overrun of the base. But, the reports also documented the administrative and legal complexities involved in integrating civilian capabilities into combat operations. The process had required coordination between multiple agencies, modification of existing regulations, and development of new training protocols. It had been successful in her specific case, but it had not been simple or easily replicable. 6 months later, Sarah received a phone call from Colonel Peterson at the Army's Training and Doctrine Command. "Mrs. Martinez, we've been working on developing a program based on your experiences in Iraq. We're calling it the Civilian Specialist Integration Program, and we'd like you to consider participating in its development. The program would formalize procedures for identifying civilian contractors with specialized skills that could contribute to military operations, establishing training protocols for integrating those contractors into military command structures, and developing legal frameworks that would allow effective utilization of civilian expertise while maintaining appropriate safeguards." "Colonel, what would my role be in this program?" "We'd like you to serve as a consultant during the development phase, helping to design training curricula and integration procedures. Eventually, if the program is successful, we might ask you to consider serving as an instructor or program manager." Sarah discussed the opportunity with James, who was supportive of her potential involvement in developing training programs that could benefit other military units. They both recognized that her experiences in Iraq had given her unique insights into the challenges and opportunities involved in civilian-military integration. She accepted the consultant position and spent the next year traveling to various military installations, working with training staff to develop procedures for identifying and integrating civilian specialists. The work was demanding but rewarding, allowing her to contribute to military effectiveness while drawing on the unique experiences she had gained at Forward Operating Base Zulu. The Civilian Specialist Integration Program was formally established 18 months later, with Sarah serving as the senior civilian instructor. The program included comprehensive screening procedures for identifying relevant civilian skills, standardized training protocols for military integration, and clear legal frameworks for maintaining appropriate civilian contractor status while enabling combat contributions. "Mrs. Martinez," said General Hawkins during the program's formal inauguration ceremony, "your experiences in Iraq have led to the development of training and integration procedures that will benefit military operations for years to come. You've helped to establish a new model for civilian-military cooperation that recognizes the value of specialized civilian expertise while maintaining appropriate military command structures." Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction in knowing that her unusual experiences had led to systemic improvements that would benefit other people in similar situations. The program would ensure that civilian contractors with relevant skills would have opportunities to contribute to military operations when appropriate, while also ensuring that proper training and legal safeguards were in place. But, perhaps more importantly, the program represented a recognition that effective military operations required the contributions of people with diverse backgrounds and skills, and that innovation often came from unexpected sources. 2 years after returning from Iraq, Sarah and James were invited back to Forward Operating Base Zulu for a ceremony recognizing the unit's successful defense of the base during their deployment. The base had been expanded and modernized, but Sarah could still identify the observation post where she had spent so many hours providing precision fire support. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, now promoted to full colonel and serving at division headquarters, spoke at the ceremony about the importance of innovation and adaptation in military operations. The successful defense of this base was accomplished through the combined efforts of soldiers, Marines, airmen, and civilian contractors working together under difficult circumstances, he said. "It demonstrates that effective military operations require us to recognize and utilize the best capabilities available, regardless of their source." After the ceremony, Sarah walked around the base with James, revisiting the locations where she had worked and fought during those intense months. The supply tent where she had been working when the first attack began was still in use, though it had been reinforced with additional protection. The command bunker observation post had been upgraded.